Keith Wallahan is the Liberal member for Menzies next door to Chisholm. Keith, welcome to Radio National Breakfast.
Thank you for having me, Kylie.
Is this the unofficial launch of the opposition's election campaign?
You could say that. It feels like, as a member of Parliament, that we are in an election campaign. I think people are coming off their summer breaks and turning their mind to the next election, and that doesn't just include us in political parties, but Australians in general.
This event is set to take place in the seat of Chisholm, as we mentioned, one of 4 Victorian seats lost to Labor in 2022. Do we have clarity? Do you have clarity on why voters rejected the Liberal Party there at the last election?
Well, one of the things that the onus on members of Parliament, and I was a new member, is to reflect upon the lessons that you learn in an election. Of course, parts of elections it's cyclical, but I think when you look at the results in Melbourne from the last election, there were 2 Liberals left in a city that will soon be Australia's largest city and will be the size of London in 2050. So that was certainly a low watermark for us, and again, when we saw that Australians were generous and Victorians were generous to the Prime Minister, we saw the results in the Aston by-election. But I think things have changed since then. I think Victorians in particular are hurting and they're looking for an alternative.
On social issues, the commentary has been that the coalition's moved further right since the last election rather than back toward the centre. You opposed the Voice to Parliament. The opposition leader has blamed immigration for the housing crisis. Does that align with those electorates you're trying to win back?
I think a lot of this commentary doesn't fit with what Australians think is centre politics and centre-right politics. The majority of Australians and the majority of Victorians voted no in the referendum, and people had their say, and we moved on from that, and that's the way these things are conducted. So I think when I hear commentary about things that are right or further right, they often don't really mean anything more than journalists, and with due respect, talking about where people align tribally. But let's talk about the things that really matter to Australians and Victorians, and it is really all about the economy. The collapse in living standards in Victoria are particularly hard, and families are living paycheck to paycheck at the moment.
Before we come on to the economy, your seat of Menzies is interesting demographically. You have the highest proportion of voters from the Chinese diaspora in Australia. You were critical of former Prime Minister Scott Morrison's rhetoric on China. Has Peter Dutton done enough to undo the damage?
So my seat is on the redrawn boundaries, the largest Chinese diaspora in Australia, 29%. I think the key thing to note about the Chinese diaspora, and I know them very well, I'm very fond of my Chinese diaspora in my community, is that they're highly aspirational, hardworking, and they're really struggling on the economic issues that I think will decide this election. There's a higher percentage of small business owners. They value education. They're concerned about the rising crime rates in Victoria. Aggravated burglaries have doubled in my area in just over 12 months. And so they're really concerned about the track that a Labor state government has had in Victoria and what that means federally.
Now, on the economy, inflation, of course, has been a global problem and it's come way down now in Australia. There's a decent chance of a cut to interest rates in February. Does Labor deserve any credit for the way that it's steered the ship to get us here, Keith Wallahan?
No, they don't, because what we get to do is to compare how inflation has been handled here in Australia with other peer economies, and it has been higher in Australia for longer. So this has been poorly managed, and the key reason it has been poorly managed is a bloated public spending budget. That has increased inflation and made the Reserve Bank's task harder.
So what spending would the coalition cut then if it were to win office? I mean, you talk about the bloated public service. Where do you make cuts there? Teachers, nurses?
Well, no, that's the headline, and that's the scare campaign that will be run in the election. We can run a more efficient government, and this isn't just a tactical point to make in a campaign. This is structural and matters for future generations. The intergenerational report notes that if we don't address government spending, then the prosperous, secure, safe Australia that we know won't exist anymore. So we have to rein it in. All parties have to try and rein in government spending. And in this term of Parliament, the public service bill has grown by 10%. It is $37.3 billion extra in 2023-2024. And at a time, this is post-COVID, we just have to remember that the public servants has grown by more than 4% to 365,000. So this extra spending is something that we can't cope at the moment in this economy where we have to bring spending down, and that matters for inflation.
And on nuclear issues, one of the biggest policy battlegrounds really this election, it seems, will be around energy and your nuclear power policy. How are those voters in your electorate that you were acknowledging earlier responding to that idea?
Well, I think we found that the reception for a conversation on what our energy system looks like in 2050 and beyond is welcome. People often lament that politics is about the 24-hour cycle, but Peter Dutton has led a conversation on what our energy systems will look like in the decades to come, and that means doing the hard work now. And as I said earlier, Melbourne will have a population the size of London in 2050. We need an energy system that is secure and reliable and affordable for Melbourne in 2050, including powering all our hospitals and schools, infrastructure and data centres.
Now, the costings were released just before Christmas, and the Coalition claimed that the nuclear plan would be far cheaper than Labor's renewables plan. But then it was quickly pointed out that you were making an kind of apples and oranges comparison with the modelling, for example, on the amount of electricity needed in the Coalition's hypothetical 2050 compared with Labor's. It's disingenuous, isn't it, to give people the impression that you're comparing the same things?
I think what's disingenuous is to put to the Australian people that we can be the only peer economy in the world to have a renewables-only policy that will bring prices down. That hasn't happened in any other peer economy. So when you look at the top 20 economies, 19 either have or are moving to nuclear. And so our policy is a renewables plus gas plus nuclear policy. And that has worked in other countries. So this isn't just hypothetical modelling. We get to actually look at other countries. We get to compare how Germany has fared compared to France. We get to compare how provinces in Canada have fared. So we're actually looking at real world examples, and we have seen how that has seen reliable and affordable baseload energy in the system.
Labor MP Keith Wallahan. Labor MP, what am I doing? It's been a long morning, Keith, already. Sorry, okay. Liberal MP, of course, Keith Wallahan. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.